In this episode, we turn to David Teece, a scholar entrepreneur and founder of the Berkeley Research Group, to look at companies and governments from a macroeconomic point of view. Together with Junian, they will discuss how companies and governments can adapt and excel in a rapidly changing technological world.
Hi everyone, I just want to welcome you to another Maxwell podcast, Maxwell En-Route, and today we have the great privilege of having David Teece with us here. And David is a co-founder of the Berkeley Research Group with over 30 years of experience providing consultancy services to businesses and government. But he's also an economist and authority on matters of industrial organization, technological change, and innovation. He's also Thomas Tuscher Professor in Global Business at the University of California's Haas School of Business in Berkeley, and he's held teaching and research positions at Stanford and Oxford universities, and he has authored many books and scholarly papers. But I'll leave him to explain one part of his CV, which I find intriguing. He calls himself a scholar entrepreneur. What is that, David?
Yes, it sounds a little bit like a contradiction, but it isn't. Perhaps it's more of an American phenomenon, but it's not uncommon to find scholars and researchers, in particular in engineering and the sciences, that are also very active in forming companies. And I've been doing that with the Berkeley Research Group and a couple of others, and building them to scale, not just little tiny startups, building them to scale, and also doing a little bit of venture capital. So scholar entrepreneur, at least in the American environment, encapsulates a little bit of the contradiction that I represent.
And why do you think, as a term, it is so unfamiliar? It must be because it's not a common role or a common kind of person. Why is that?
I think it's because it takes a lot to be a serious scholar, to stay on the frontiers of a subject. And so to be able to do that and, with the other hand, build companies, to some people seems like a pretty exhausting enterprise. But believe it or not, there are a lot of synergies that improve my scholarship, I believe, from being involved with industry. And so I live in the world of what I call middle theory. It's not high theory, not high mathematical theory, but it's sort of middle theory where I conceptualize what business is all about and how to build competitive advantage and how to build companies and make them great and keep them great. And I couldn't do that as well as I do, I think, absent the engagement with industry itself.
Right, which is interesting because one of the criticisms I hear of academics who purport to be able to, be experts in a particular field is that they don't practice that field. They just sort of teach and discuss with other academics, but the people on the ground say, hey, do you realize that what you're teaching is totally disconnected with what we're actually doing? Do you find that a reason why your particular melding of these two worlds is really an important thing?
Yes, it is. And, there's thousands of scholarly papers out there, but I can quickly eliminate those that are so far from the reality that I know that I can focus my efforts, my limited amount of time, on reading the papers that really matter the most and contributing papers that hopefully matter a lot. And that's what I've been able to achieve. I have a lot of papers that have had very high impact. And I put that down to the fact that to the reader, it resonates authentically with the business they know, but at the same time, it's in a theoretical framework that helps them understand something beyond the particular case circumstance that they may be familiar with.
Right. Okay. And you've recently sort of been saying that we are now in a period of unprecedented global, geopolitical, technological risk or uncertainty. And so what does it mean? Why do you say that?
Well, there's always been technological uncertainty. We've had technological change for a long time. The rate of increase of innovation is something that people dispute, but I do believe that there is an increase in the rate of innovation and the nature of innovation, and in particular, the nature of business models. I mean, with the internet, all kinds of business models are now possible that were impossible before. So a lot of the predictability and the normality of building a business is sort of turned on its head. But on top of that uncertainty, you now have geopolitical uncertainty. We had 70 plus years of relative stability in the post-war period, essentially, following the global system that the United States, Europe, and Great Britain sort of set up. But now with the rise of China, particularly not so much the rise of China, but the rise of Xi Jinping, I would say, it's clear that they're not the rules that China wants to live by. And so that has injected instability and uncertainty into the way we do business. And that's, I think, a very new factor.
Which is what I find interesting, because why would China today under Xi Jinping be different from the Soviet Union under so many previous Soviet dictators?
Russia was a military power, primarily a nuclear power, but its economy back then and now was very small and was separate. There wasn't much trade with the West and vice versa. China is a completely different circumstance, where we rely on China for supply of many manufactured goods, and China relies on the West. So there is deep interdependence. That's what globalization brought us. And we thought that was great because we could get things at very low cost, and we could specialize in doing what we do best. That's a very different world, this deep interdependence, than what existed in the Cold War period, if you will. So we've got a very different economic and political circumstance where we're tied together in ways we weren't tied together before.
Well, wouldn't that actually be a reason why we are less likely to see the kind of military confrontations that we saw in the Cold War, because now China has so much more to lose? I heard someone once say that the Russians would embark on military enterprises like the invasion of Ukraine because it knows that it can't beat the West economically and technologically. And so, it uses projection of power to sort of continue to remain great and relevant. But China, at some level, believes that it can win the economic game and the technological game at some point in the not too far future, which then suggests that it may not be the only option for China just to use force. It could really just say, I just need to prevent you from strangling my economy, and at some point, I will win this game. What do you think about sentiments of that sort?
I think it's certainly something to pay attention to. But as the Chinese economy slows, it's not so clear that, in fact, they're going to win. Although I think they're unquestionably very, very determined. I mean, I think that's the difference between China and the West. The West has got many agendas. People have many agendas. China is focused on winning, if you will, geopolitically, whereas the United States has got multiple agendas and really just wants to preserve the system that it's familiar with and not necessarily win in any sense.
And so in practical terms, what does that mean, this geopolitical struggle that's arising? What does it mean for the average company, the average person on the ground?
Well, I like to distinguish between risk, which has always been part of the business environment, and uncertainty. The difference with risk, there are certain events that you expect, whether it's a cyclone or an earthquake or a recession, for instance, and you can put probabilities on it and you can sort of hedge and prepare for it. With uncertainty, it's all about the unknown unknowns. And this requires a very different way of managing the enterprise. You can't hedge against uncertainty. You have to build scenarios and prepare for the unknown. And how do you prepare for the unknown? Well, the answer is you've kind of got to build in agility so that when those unknowns happens, you've got some resilience and responsiveness. So it's a very different managerial challenge, and I don't think that's really sunk in. People think, okay, there's a little bit more uptick in risk, so we've got our risk management department. We'll just continue to make sure we're diligent about the way we manage risk. But when there are black swans all over the place, that doesn't work anymore. So I think people get lulled into believing that if they got risk management tools in place, that they're protected when they're not.
Interesting. Would it be fair to say that an analogy would be if you were NASA sending a deep space probe to the edges of the solar system over a 30-year mission, you have no way of predicting what you don't know and what you could plan for, and you just need to build as much adaptability, flexibility, and resilience into your systems and sort of figure things out as you go along. Would that be one way of describing this?
Yeah, it was Apollo 13, I think, where in fact they had the explosion and they managed to cobble together a solution and get the astronauts back. But that's exactly correct. I mean, you're on a journey into the unknown, and it's about the unknown unknowns. There's a famous economist by the name of Frank Knight that made this distinction over 100 years ago, but it's sort of been lost because everyone wants to have a tool. And risk you can mathematize and you can set up risk management protocols. It's easier to manage, so we focus on managing that which is easy and forget about the real risk, if you will, risk in capital R, which is deep uncertainty.
Right. And so how would you describe this, whatever companies need to do in order to be able to deal with this increasing uncertainty in the world today?
Well, I have a framework called dynamic capabilities, and there are sort of three key elements to it, and that's the ability of an organization to sense things, what may be coming next, because you don't have to be completely surprised. You don't need to be flabbergasted with everything that happens. You have to, if you're doing scenario planning and so forth, and you can, have some realistic expectations. And then you've got to execute based on your sensing mechanisms, and then transform. So sense, sees, transform, the kind of the mantra that drives a company with strong dynamic capabilities. To be able to do that quickly, to do it accurately, and that requires a lot more resilience in the organization. It requires managements and boards to work together. It requires sort of pre-thinking how to deal with possible uncertain futures. It's a different style of management. It's not about efficiency and taking the last penny out of the cost structure. You see, that's what firms have been doing with globalization. How can I source something and squeeze the last penny out of the cost structure? And a lot of companies are still doing that today. And that's a fool's errand, in my view, when you have deep uncertainty. So you have to reconfigure supply chains. You've got to build in resilience, and you've also got to build in the resilience to change quickly when, in fact, you have a surprise.
But see, wouldn't that be fairly sort of logical and obvious for companies who are in the day-to-day business of growing and expanding and developing new products? Wouldn't what you just said be something that seems to be like very, very clearly something they must focus on? But yet we see many large companies over the years, they sort of miss something, very glaring change, and then before long they're left behind. And I would put Nokia, for example, on the table, and we just talked about Kodak. Companies that, for all their market dominance, somehow just miss the change, and before long they're a footnote. Why do you think that happened?
Well, maybe it's because of their market dominance. Look, I think it happens not everywhere. I think Silicon Valley firms have got much stronger or deeper dynamic capabilities than most. I think American and Chinese firms are actually relatively agile. When I say agile, I mean agile in a strategic sense. I think Europe probably lags in that regard. So in some sense, it's common sense if you've got a clean sheet of paper. But if you got a lot of legacy assets around and a lot of habits from the past, you just keep doing what you did yesterday with a little bit of change. In fact, you need to be big and bold about the way you attack these issues and think them through. And it may cost you something in the short run. You may have to sacrifice some efficiency in order to build resilience. And that's where you need supportive boards. And if the shareholders are thinking about just today and not tomorrow, it's hard for the top management team to stare down the short-termers and We use this term shareholders, but it's a misnomer. Most people that own stocks only own them for a very, very short period of time. So I think of them more as traders.
Right.
True shareholders are people that hold stocks longer term, and there are not many of those around. But the activists and the people that put pressure on companies are very temporary shareholders, and I don't think they deserve the voice they have.
Right. Okay. I mean, I guess what you're saying is that for many established companies, there's in a way a sunken cost that they're trying to now maximize the returns from. So there's that unwillingness to throw it out if it still works. If I can still extract a bit more profit out of it, why would I want to move to something else which has, as you say, uncertain returns and so on? So you end up with that inertia that before long it's a bit too late. So one of the things I noticed on my travels is that there are many first world countries that adopted very extensive telephone lines for many generations, landlines that run across your street and people pick up the phone and call each other. And then many third world countries didn't have any infrastructure of that sort. They didn't have any phones at all. And then when the mobile phone came about, it became a problem for these first world countries to say, well, we're just going to sort of abandon all of this infrastructure that we built for the last 50 years and just move to cell cable networks and stuff. But for the countries that had nothing, it was like, for the first time, you could actually call your neighbor in another village because you have a mobile phone. So in a way that's playing out where the companies that have spent a lot of time and money building something, they're not so willing to change because of how much they've already invested in it. Is that something that you see?
That's a good example. It's the legacy assets can sometimes be a drag. And, as an economist, you were taught that bygones are bygones. So you should think of the fact that, look, those assets are worth zero. They may, on the books look like they're worth something, but this is where you've got to look through the accounting statement to the fundamental economics and say, look, those assets aren't worth anything. We should trash them and start all over again, or transition very quickly into that new regime. So this is where I think the mentality of an economist actually is perhaps a little better than the mentality of accountants, because you know that the asset's already worthless, and so you're not necessarily trying to salvage it.
Is this a problem that's limited only to companies? Do you think governments and large, public agencies also struggle with this kind of mindset change? I mean, do they have innate dynamic capabilities, or do they also need to change?
Well, they may not have the legacy assets in the balance sheet sense, so that they're trying to protect, but they have legacy mindsets. We all have legacy mindsets. We all have habits. And sometimes the new replaces the old only as people move on, because people, are very slow at re-engineering themselves. But this is where leadership comes in, whether it's in government, whether it's at the corporate level, with management boards. We need leadership, and we need big, bold, courageous leaders. Lee Kuan Yew was a big, bold, courageous leader. We need people like that, and we have them occasionally in the industry. You cannot find a great company that didn't at some point have a great leader that was willing to make big, bold, and brassy decisions.
But of course, it doesn't always, sit well with people who feel like this person is too much of a risk taker. I mean, Steve Jobs himself was turfed out of Apple before he was invited back. And people were saying that looked like the journey of Sam Altman at OpenAI. But now, as every day that passes, the story becomes a little bit more intriguing.
Yeah, the Altman story is very intriguing, because it's like at the end of the day, the board may get thrown out. And that doesn't happen very often, and it should happen more often in my mind.
Yes. So this is an interesting question that now we've sort of segued into tech. Now, you also say that we are in a period of great uncertainty because of tech. Again, why do you say that? Because we've always had technology making some segments of industry obsolete, some practices irrelevant, people fearing for their jobs. It's always been the story of humanity, as it will. Why now? What's particular about this era?
Well, you're right. In a qualitative sense, it's been there for a long, long time, through the first, second industrial revolutions, for sure. As I said before, the internet and the modern economy is one that it's not just that tech is changing, but business models are changing at the same time. I mean, take autonomous vehicles or electrification of the automobile. This is multiple paradigm shifts taking place simultaneously. So it's more disruptive in some fundamental sense. But you're right, it's just quantitatively different, but we've seen elements of this throughout human history.
So is there anything to fear in particular about this era compared to, we've been fine in the past? And yes, some companies will rise, some will fall when the dust settles. Things on the whole will still carry on, wouldn't it?
Well, with AI, of course, there's deeply intriguing questions about that we haven't had to face before about, whether artificial intelligence can trump human intelligence and control humans and things of that kind. But, the printing press was something that was controlling or leading to the disintermediation, if you will, of the church. Mm-hmm. So you've had these big step changes before, but they all appear at the time you confront them to be new and to be formidable. And I think you have to take into account from a business point of view, it's not just the tech changes themselves, but it's the reactions of government to it and the regulatory side. So if you're sitting as a CEO, as a board, you not only have to deal with the tech, but then you have to think about what's government going to do or not do. And governments are taking bold steps. I mean, China has, Europe with its Digital Markets Act. U.S. has not been quite so bold. And I think that's a good thing in a way because we get to learn from the mistakes of the Europeans. I think the DMA is a bit of an overreach, but time will tell. So long as we're poised and have dynamic capabilities to intervene when in fact there is a clearer solution, we're better off. I don't necessarily convince that we will, but there is that opportunity.
But that's an interesting question that arises because of AI and the power of tech today, where representative governments can't govern without the support of the people. And if the people are influenced in ways by tech that are, in a way that favors the tech companies in their fight against regulation and government control, then wouldn't it be fair to say that increasingly governments are getting weaker and weaker and tech companies are getting stronger and stronger because the balance is shifting in favor of the tech companies being able to sway public opinion to them in a way that they couldn't in the past?
Well, I remind you, with the invention of television, we had presidential debates. That was a very big change in politics. So we've had technology impacting politics before. This one is probably a little bit more, perhaps a lot more complicated. But in terms of the private sector versus government, government is still strong. Government can regulate. Government really holds most of the cards here. They may not regulate, but if they wish to regulate, they can. Now, of course, companies can move offshore, they can go elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera. But government is certainly not toothless, at least not in the Western democracy.
Well, an interesting case study would be what literally just happened in the last couple of days in Argentina, where the new president of Argentina was elected. And some are saying that that's the first possible AI election where both sides used extensive amounts of generative AI to create attack ads, basically sort of trying to accuse each other of being bad for the country. And the candidate that eventually won has very different, in fact, they are almost polar opposites. The two candidates that were running were polar opposites, which means that it is theoretically possible that a small amount of influence exerted by someone, and it could even be the tech companies in the way that they are very opaque algorithms sort of feed stories to people during an election season, that could end up with a country going either this way or that in very diametrically opposite directions because of the candidate that eventually gets elected in a close fight. So that wouldn't that also then suggest that in some ways, for example, if you had a candidate that ran on the idea of curbing the power of the tech companies and his opponent somehow surged in the lead, and all sorts of sort of comments were appearing on social media attacking this person in charge in favor of controlling the tech companies. And you're like, who are these people commenting on this? Are these bots? Are these quirks of the algorithm that's amplifying certain conspiracy theories and stuff like that? I mean, these are genuine concerns. I don't know whether they are misguided, unfounded, but they seem to be things that people are talking about today.
Well, but look at the predicate of your question. When things are close, it can make a difference. So you can take some comfort from that because it could go either way, right? But, if a nation is, a strong majority is over on one side versus the other, then it maybe by the same logic doesn't matter quite as much. But you're right. It can flip an election. I think, Argentina used to be the richest country in the world. Argentina, if you look at 1900, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, Canada had the highest GDPs per capita. And, Argentina's fallen more dramatically than the others. And, as an economist and forgetting about the politics of it, some kind of radical change is necessary. So we'll see what happens in Argentina. But I think you're right that there are political consequences. We need to be very sensitive to them, but it's not time to, throw your hands up and say it's all lost at all. I don't think it is. I mean, television likewise had a big impact at the margin in the Kennedy-Nixon debates. That I think pushed Kennedy over the top.
Right. Okay. When you advise governments and when you advise companies, do you fundamentally sort of give them the same broad sort of things and tools so that they can build their dynamic capabilities, or do you find that it's quite different when you deal with a private company versus a government?
Yeah. I don't think the dynamic capabilities framework is yet being worked out in enough detail to be of assistance to government. In fact, I'm working on that with a colleague at University College London, Marianne Muscato in the UK. So we're now starting to think about dynamic capabilities in the public sector. They're clearly needed, but the economics, the incentives are very different from the private sector. And so it's going to require re-engineering the framework, but I think we're up for it.
I think you mentioned in one of our previous conversations that very often for companies, the point where they interface with governments is through the GCs, the general counsels. So do you have anything in particular that you wish GCs did more of to help their own interests in their company and you don't see it as much?
Yeah, I actually believe that the role of the GC in the world we're in now is much greater than it's been in the last 70 or 80 years, because it's more important in the Western democracies for government and industry to be working together. Not only is there regulation, but in fact, government, wants to invite engagement in questions like export controls, for instance, in terms of working out the full systems effect. People in government really don't have much idea. They don't have the deep granular knowledge of, say, the semiconductor industry that you would need to be able to craft export controls. So there is the need, I think, to cooperate in ways that is unusual. I mean, China, of course, it's hand in glove between government and industry, and I call that systemic competition. China is systemic competition, a systemic competitor where government and industry are basically acting in unison. That's not the way of the West, but it needs to be a bit more of the way of the West, and the GC is a liaison, I believe. And the most CEOs are trained, in finance and marketing and all the things we teach them in business school, but they're not trained to deal with these complex geopolitical issues and the regulatory issues. And as they become more and more important, I think the GC becomes more and more important. And I would expect more CEOs in the future to have a legal background or at least some engagement with government. That's going to be more important than finance. So
the role of the GC is increasingly important, but what precisely do they need to do more of compared to what they're doing today?
Well, I think, the GC, or someone trained in the law is sort of the last generalist. I mean, in the university world and in business schools, we tend to create specialists, but the GC is a generalist. And they're able to, if they're good, to put their head around, not just the regulatory side, but the technological, the business side as well. So I think they can be proactive in terms of reaching out to government and, forming soft alliances and arrangements with government. There's always been a fear, of course, historically, of government and industry being too close. But in fact, you need them to be close to be able to manage these deep geopolitical issues. You can't deal with, if you're a business in China, you can't deal with it without a little bit of help from the U.S. government. And it's not even clear it makes much difference it's not even clear it'll be all that efficacious at the end of the day, but you have a better shot than if you're trying to do it alone.
I guess the fear that people have of the government and the companies becoming too close together is then whose job is it to protect the consumer? I think that's always that fear that people have, that they rely on the elected government to protect them from the profit-making entities out there. Isn't that one of the issues?
Well, I think it's no longer about consumers, it's about citizens. I mean, national security is now a major item. I mean, if you listen to what both statesmen in the United States and in Europe say, they're actually appealing to business for the first time to say, listen, you have to take national security into account. It's Europe 1938, basically, right. All over again. I'm not sure that industry is listening. But this is a kind of thing where the GC can say, when the Secretary of State, Blinken, essentially puts this out that industry has to pay attention to national security issues. There's no law behind it. But this is where you would hope GCs and boards of directors would take that seriously and say, all right, what should we be doing differently from the way we've done it in the past?
But that's always a challenge, right? Especially when you have a company that's so embedded that its global supply chains reach across so many different places, including supposedly adversarial countries like between the US and China. And the mind of the businessman would be, well, there are politicians, they come and go. Today we're friends, tomorrow we're enemies. Why should I, re-engineer my entire company based on the flavor of the month in terms of our relationship between these two countries when the next day we may be best friends and I've lost an opportunity to go even deeper into that market. So what would you say to that?
Well, what I would say is that you have to determine whether this is flavor of the month stuff or whether this Xi Jinping and his successors are absolutely determined on the path they're going down. I believe it's the latter, in which case it's not a flavor of the month. It's a secular shift in the geopolitical landscape, and that's what you got to prepare for. But you're posing the question the right way. You have to figure out if this is a flavor of the month. And so Xi Jinping and Biden meet in San Francisco, but my reading of what happened is no fundamental change. There's some little superficial and maybe even important modifications, but it's very clear if you read Xi Jinping's speeches what his long-term goal is and what the world will look like. In fact, he goes so far as to say that war with the West is inevitable. And if I'm an executive, I should be having somebody such as a GC translating that stuff, or at least informing me of what these potential realities are.
Very interesting. And so we're looking at what you're saying now as the end of that 75 years of relative, peace, and going back to almost an era where, as I think you mentioned yesterday, an interwar period between the First and Second World War, where before all of we had a League of Nations, but the UN itself, with a lot more strength, wasn't around yet. Countries were still dominated by the powerful countries and so on. So is that what you're saying, that we are likely to be moving towards increasingly in this era because of all these different uncertainties?
Yes, some people use the term a vacation from history, that history has been one of war and turbulence. The period 1945 to 2015 or something or other was a period of great stability, which has now been upset, in my view, in a permanent way. And we have to recognize that. It's a relative decline of U.S. power and the relative increase in China's power, and China very clearly saying, we don't want to live by the rules of the past, that remind us of the Opium Wars and things like that, and we got to be put in our place, and that's a very different world, and I think it affects going to affect everybody.
This has been extremely fascinating, and unfortunately we have to bring it to a close soon. But I would like to end with a question for you. Like, if you could, sort of do one thing that would affect the way the world would look for your future grandchildren, something that you might not normally be able to do as an individual, but let's say as a wish list, you could change just one thing in the world or the trajectory of the world for your grandchildren's sake, what would it be?
Well, that's a very difficult one that I'll have to brood over. But it'll be something to do with keeping the pace of innovation going in the West, because the way to secure the freedoms of the world is for the Western world writ large to maintain its technological leadership, but also keep that under control in the sense of making sure it doesn't go out of bounds.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, David. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and we hope that this will not be the last time you're with us for a podcast.
My great pleasure, too.
Well, have a great day, David.